As is tradition, I spent the time between Christmas and New Year's taking a break from video making and playing old games, instead catching up on some modern gaming, specifically wrapping up Armored Core 6. I'm sure the thought of enjoying something on a system from this decade might scare you, but honestly, it's nice to take a step away from gaming's past every now and then to help ground your gaming appreciations. Once I'd gotten to the end and reflected a little on the experience, I couldn't help but ponder just what makes a great mecha game, and got a little spark of inspiration to dive into the collection and see how some of the games I have in it managed to live up to that idea. Well, at least the version of that which happens to sit in my head. It seems only fair to start this little adventure by taking a look into Armored Core's past, which, in terms of my collection at least, means we're checking out Armored Core 2, which hit the PlayStation 2 all the way back in 2000. Yikes. Where its predecessors were all based on Earth, Armored Core 2 hops over to Mars during the midst of a great terraforming and migration project. Once again, you're a Raven, a mercenary picking up assignments from those corporations, and these can range from hunting down rogue employees to sabotaging power systems and plenty more. The real joy, of course, comes from the customization of your AC before you deploy onto a mission. It's not just about assigning a weapons loadout, but customizing all of its systems. The components which make up the physical body, the power generation systems, heat management, and more. All of this truly makes your AC yours. And that of course means whether you prefer to arm yourself in order to take on enemies at range, which is my typical strategy, or prefer to close up and get dirty with them in order to slash at them with a laser sword instead. Between missions, you've also got the arena. Here, you need to work your way up the leaderboard, besting 49 other pilots in one-on-one combat, each of whom happens to deploy their own custom AC into the field. Being able to adapt your piloting, your strategy, your loadouts to each one of these is paramount should you want to make serious progress up the ladder, and you do get rewards for this in terms of additional money and additional parts to put on your own AC. The big challenge when picking this, or honestly most of the earlier games in the series up, is in the controls. Calling them awkward is probably the best way to do it justice. Now you can master them with a bit of practice, and you can tweak some of the button layouts, but I did find it took some time to really click with them. When you do though, you can find yourself seriously engrossed in the game, especially the thrill you get after surviving a mission, while you're running low on ammo and you've got little armor points remaining. Unlike most other mecha games, the ACs of Armored Core aren't the type that zip about the map with leaps and bounds. But they're not slow walking tanks either. You do have boosters that give you some degree of mobility or flight, but until you get some upgrades installed, they'll drain your energy rather rapidly, and recharging that when you've drained it can take some serious time as well. When it happens, you've got to let it recharge to full. You can't just engage them in the middle of the recharge cycle. Combat then becomes a mix of getting close in to deliver damage to your enemy, but also being able to maneuver enough to keep out of enemy fire and keeping distance to maintain a lock on your enemies. Locks are life after all, as your shots won't hit unless you're locked onto an enemy, so moving enemies do require a bit of tracking there. Though, it does bring some annoyance as some missions have static targets that you need to destroy which don't appear on a radar and that you can't lock onto. Oops, you've just got to be really careful in those scenarios. Of all the games I'm going to feature in this video, Armored Core 2 just happens to be the newest one on the list. So it's no surprise to say that, yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive game, thanks to that focus on having to customize your AC ahead of missions, alongside the variety of objectives and missions that you'll face. It may be tough to pick up, and yes, I'm saying that from personal experience, but it makes for one that you can really sink your teeth into should it happen to click with you. So, we're going to jump back from early 2000s gaming to a few hardware generations back and go 16-bit, with Mechwarrior on the Super NES, which was developed by Beam Software and published by Activision in 1993. Now, I've covered this one in more detail previously on the channel, so there'll be a card in the corner should you want to learn more about it, so we'll keep this one brief. Mechwarrior on SNES is a reworking of the 1989 PC game originally developed by Dynamics. The story shares similar beats, being a quest for revenge against a mercenary outfit who have killed your family. This time though, you're not a descendant of royalty aiming to reclaim a trinket to prove your claim to rule, rather you're just some person. The main game has you undertaking missions to track down the outfit, with each successful mission getting you one step closer on their trail. You can see this as you visit the bar between missions, and it gives you patrons to talk to, but also reading up on news events and viewing secretive holovids. You can get little pointers to where you need to go next from that point. One or more of these do reference a planet, and that's your intended mission destination, which you do by visiting the GHQ and picking up a contract that'll take you there. Now, these missions tend to be pretty simplistic in nature. Most of them require you to just simply take out a number of enemies, for instance. There are some unique ones amongst the pile though. One has you searching the map for a cache of ammo left by the enemy, and there are others which have you typically defending a place from enemy mech attacks. Where Mechwarrior stands out for me is in its choice to go with a first-person view. Now that makes sense on a PC or more powerful system, but on the Super NES, it uses the scaling hardware, Mode 7, to scale and rotate the map, and you see this during the drop sequence, which really builds up the excitement as you're deploying. Of course, before you deploy, it's important to make sure your mech is prepared. Considering what we've got on offer here, there's some quite handy customization. You can buy one of 8 mechs, and that ranges all 4 classes of mech from Battletech, so lights, mediums, heavy, and assault, and you can tune their loadouts, and that's not just limited to swapping out weapons, but you can also add or remove armor, or even add jump jets or take them away. And taking advantage of this is really important. Your starting mech isn't great, and for instance, I found taking out the jump jets, adding heavier weapons, really made it a much more capable fighting vehicle. And the game does prod you to do this when you're talking to the bartender early on. Now yes, Mechwarrior on Super NES is probably a simpler game than most of the others here, but I really found the mech-based battling and action managed to satisfy quite a bit of craving here. I was really impressed when I originally looked at it, and coming back to it all these years later, I still think it's a pretty cool game, considering the hardware and the limitations of the time. Time for another example of 16-bit mecha fun, and with a little cross-platform comparison added into the mix. Most players are going to know this game as Mechwarrior 3050, as released on the Super NES again in 1995. But it originally saw release a year prior in North America, where it was technically an exclusive for the Genesis or Mega Drive, but I feel right calling it a Genesis game, where it was simply titled Battletech. Here, you're a Mechwarrior in Clan Wolf as they participate in the clan invasion, which, if you know your Battletech, is a pretty big thing. And you're sent to undertake assignments across 5 different worlds. Each world, the mission there is broken up into a set of smaller objectives which need to be taken care of first before you can tackle that main one and move on to the next. Prior to deployment, you can set your weapons loadout on your Timberwolf. The game basically has 3 weapon slots. One is for your primary guns, one is for a tactical weapon, and the other, heavy ordnance. Each has its own use, and knowing which one you want to take for a given map is very important if you want to succeed. Once you get into battle, the isometric view really gives you the feeling that I got when getting into the strike games. And that, well, I can really vibe with. Though, unlike those, the difficulty curve is not quite as gentle as perhaps it should be when starting out. And, basically, the difficulty is probably one of the big sticking points. particularly once you get into a scrap with enemy mechs, as if you're not quick on the draw and you're not accurate in your shots, it's pretty easy for them to overwhelm you, push your heat up to the max, and take you out fairly quickly. Some of the objectives on those later worlds are also a bit of a challenge, whether taking out objectives within a very tight time limit and little guidance, or having to locate your objectives without access to your radar. It reinforces the need to learn these maps if you want to be able to succeed. Now, the interesting point here is really the head-to-head comparison between both systems. There is one gameplay advantage in playing on the Super NES, and that is the ability to do a torso twist and rotate your mech's torso while you're lining up against targets. It can be incredibly handy in situations where you just can't stand still in order to take out a target. Performance is a different story though. Compared to its Mega Drive Genesis counterpart, there is a fair chunk of slowdown at times with Mechwarrior 3050 on the Super NES, though this isn't going to make it unplayable. There is slowdown, and that's something you tend to expect with a lot of games there, but yeah, it is a much smoother experience when played on the Mega Drive Genesis. Another thing is the camera, which surprisingly manages to impact the difficulty just a bit though. Essentially, on Battletech on the Genesis Mega Drive, the camera is pulled out a little further. It means enemies get activated a little further away from you than in comparison to Mechwarrior 3050 on the Super NES. So the Super NES game is just a little easier. Not much, but just a little easier. Regardless of which one you want to play, you're still going to be challenged somewhat. Now, of the games I'm going to feature in this episode, Mechwarrior 3050/Battletech is probably the most action-centric one I feature. But 16-bit consoles were more about sort of action games than simulation. The simulation thing leaking onto consoles was more of a 32-bit era kind of thing. And so I think it fits that vibe for those machines pretty well. As we're going to see, moving on to the next game.
Danger. Overheating.
This little grouping of games has been a little Battletech heavy, and I'm not sorry for that. It's really the series that got me into Mecha and Giant Robots, so it obviously stokes a lot of curiosity in my collecting as well. And that brings us to Mechwarrior 2. Sadly, don't get excited. I'm not talking about the original PC game here. Oh, I wish I had the resources to have an era-appropriate PC to capture from. So instead, we're looking at the conversions released on both the PlayStation and Saturn in 1997, which were done by Quantum Factory. Now, the first thing to note here, both of these versions were released under the Arcade Combat Edition subtitle, and that sums up a lot of what's been done to make them playable on a console controller versus a keyboard and mouse joystick on a PC, and also working within the hardware limitations of both machines. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to sum the story up here. It's intertwines with a lot of Battletech stuff. If you're interested, go read it up on Sana. But you're a Mechwarrior in the forces of one of two clans. Clan Wolf, surprise surprise, or Clan Jade Falcon. Each clan has one of three campaigns to complete. The first is that of the original PC game, and it's the longest on what's on offer, but there are two smaller bonus ones added in. Now, the biggest change here over the PC original is customization. Sadly, you don't have the ability to freely edit the configuration of your mech. Rather, you could pick like variant A or variant B. Now, it makes sense why this was done. The original PC game had a very mouse-driven interface here, and honestly, it was a bit lengthy to do and adjust things in a lot of ways, and a console player probably doesn't want to experience that. So I get it. You can at least still group your weapons, and that's actually something you can do now before you deploy. On the PC original, you had to do that once you are in the field. Speaking of getting in the field, once you're in battle, I really found the game plays rather well. Mostly. The core feeling of Mechwarrior 2 is present, the game feels like it does in the PC original, though it is sped up a bit, maps are smaller, there's no time limit in missions anymore, and things like that. You still have to balance heat with your weapon use, and learning to prioritize which enemy mechs are worth taking out first in order to satisfy your mission objectives. All of that is carried over and conveys pretty well. The real thing with the Arcade Combat Edition here is the power-ups. These are rotating objects that you'll encounter out in the field, and they give you temporary buffs when collected. Some might boost the power of your heatsinks, others make your mech invulnerable, or even give your mech a repair, which can be very handy. It might not necessarily turn the tide of battle, but it can be the kind of bonus that just helps out at the right time. Now, having spent time with both the PlayStation and Saturn versions of this, the first niggle I have is the soundtrack. And this is me being overly fond for the PC original, which I still think holds up pretty well today. But the soundtrack on the PC version is a legendary ambient soundtrack. On these console versions, it takes a few more cues from the later Mechwarrior 2 Mercenaries, which wasn't ambient, it was more of a rock kind of approach, and it just doesn't fit the vibe right for me. I imagine it was easier to bring those tracks over, but whatever, I'm not a big fan of it. The other thing is about controls, and it's a real minor thing that makes me prefer the Saturn version of the game. Basically, when you set your speed, it holds it. You just press up and down on the D-pad to increase or decrease your speed, and it holds it. It acts like cruise control. On the PlayStation, you have to constantly hold the D-pad forward. I don't know why this was done. It's actually really annoying. You can't lock your speed. You can't say cruise at a slower speed. You basically, unless you keep tapping. It's infuriating. It actually turned me off playing it properly for quite a while. I've gotten used to it a bit, playing it recently to grab the footage for this video, but I'm not a fan. Maybe it's just me getting, aging or whatever. Despite all that, Mechwarrior 2 Arcade Combat Edition is a satisfactory simplification of an iconic PC game. Now, I'll admit, if I was given the choice of these versions, or the original PC one, I would 110% of the time go for the PC one anytime. They're like, it's if you're in a desert and there's some warm water to drink. It's water, and it's good, but it won't satisfy you the same as a nice, chilled glass of this. So here we are with the last game on the list, and it's Game Arts' Gungriffon, which hit the Sega Saturn in 1996. The year is 2074, and once again, the world is at war. Surprise, surprise. You're part of the United American countries, deployed to the field in a high-max combat vehicle. You'll be sent on one of 8 operations, spanning from Russia and Ukraine into Mongolia and China. Compared to other games featured here, the story is kind of minimal, the only real background provided by the manual. What also makes Gungriffon unique is that each mission is played against the clock. In fact, it combines with the way that scoring is handled, which we'll touch on later. It gives you a serious arcade vibe, which I guess is kind of fitting being that this is a Sega Saturn game. Your High-Max is kitted out with 4 weapons: a powerful cannon, machine guns, rocket pods, and anti-tank missiles. Juggling your use of them is critical. You don't get a load of ammo for most of them, outside of the machine guns, which do have unlimited ammo. But you can't go gung-ho with those, because they'll overheat and jam from overuse. For the other weapons, you can find supply helicopters located on the mission area, and they'll resupply your ammo and fix your damage. Now, touching upon the arcade feeling of Gungriffon, well, it carries into piloting the High-Max itself. Compared to the other games I've talked about, it's a much more agile machine to control, whether that's running about on the ground or making leaps into the air. And this sensation, I say, is boosted by the scale of things, as the High-Max doesn't tower over the tanks and regular forces you'll encounter in battle. Once you reach the end of a mission, you do get a mission report, and this will give you a score based on what you've destroyed during battle and how much time was left in the mission. Should you do well enough, you'll earn a place on the high score table, where thankfully you can retry these missions at any time to see if you can earn a better spot there. This more arcadey tone might feel a little different compared to the other games I featured here, but I found Gungriffon to be quite intriguing. Yes, it might ease up on those simulation elements, but I found that carries into the future war fantasy a bit better of what it might be like to pilot a smaller scale mecha in a sort of more grounded kind of fight compared to some of the other games that we've featured. And that's my picks. This isn't an exhaustive survey of the mecha games I've got in my collection. I did want to leave room for a follow-up after all. Of these 5 games, there are a few things I can identify really makes a good mecha game stand out for me. Customization is obviously the first one on the list. Whether that's just having a large enough roster of them to pilot that you can choose from, something that console versions of Mechwarrior 2 allow for, or the depth of customization of systems and loadouts that the Armored Core games offer. We see that here with Armored Core 2. I was definitely surprised in revisiting Mechwarrior on Super NES. Though it offers a simple degree of customization, I still was impressed. Even against the original PC game, which I hadn't played properly for a long time, which offers no room for customization at all. Secondly, it's the mission variety. Going on a rampage, doing the same kind of things, does get dull after a while. But whether it's a variety of locales you get to visit, it does keep things feeling fresh. I really loved how Gungriffon gave you a mission, for example, where you've got to use night vision goggles in order to get around. It really made it feel very different than like fighting during the day. It's also something I appreciated with Mechwarrior 3050 and Battletech. The differing environmental hazards offered by the later worlds really mixed things up and kept them interesting. Despite the challenges those stages brought up, having a world where you've got to be careful where you step, or you walk into lava or hot areas that will damage your mech rapidly, really made for an interesting challenge in learning the map and having to know where your objectives are and being able to get there. Third and final one is the sense of progression. Having a fixed campaign that you work your way through really helps a lot on that front. But also things like ranks and being able to save your progress. The arena in Armored Core 2 helps with that again. And of course in Mechwarrior 3050 and Battletech, you get the token ranking increase. Similar things of course happen in Mechwarrior 2 as well, and all of that. But I think that's pretty much all for me here. Again, like I said earlier, if you enjoyed the video, you want to see me talk about more of them, more in my collection or whatnot, drop by the comments and let's chat about it. Not only for thoughts on the games I've featured here, but also is that follow-up something that's worth doing at some point. Plus, I'd always be up for hearing for games which might be worth checking out, knowing that I enjoy these. Of course, if they've got PAL-friendly versions. Most of my systems are PAL. I know some people hate PAL. Sorry, I live in a PAL region. Most of my systems are PAL. Deal with it. There is, of course, all the other stuff as well. Subscribing and doing the notification thing, yes, it's annoying, but it does help, get these videos in front of your faces. There's also my new episodes mailing list. I send an email when an episode comes out in case you don't want that. In case you don't want to rely on your subscriptions to be at the whims of platforms that do like hiding things from you. Or if you want to support the show and what I'm doing here, help keep this thing running independently as it is, check out the Patreon page as well. There are links all in the video description should you do that thing. And other than that, what's left for me to say but just to thank you all very much for watching.